The grand hall was filled with lights, voices, and laughter. As people from the city's richest families gathered for a charity event, the air smelled of expensive perfumes, polished wood, and fresh flowers on the stage. Golden decorations glittered under the bright chandeliers. Everywhere one looked, there were tables lined with fine food and glasses of sparkling drinks. Men in suits and women in shining dresses walked proudly, talking about business, politics, and money. At the far end of the hall, away from the glowing stage, a small group of children stood quietly. They were not dressed in fine clothes. Their shirts were plain, their shoes worn, and their eyes held a sadness that no one in the glamorous crowd seemed to notice. They were orphans, brought there by the organizers to remind the rich guests of the cause they were supposed to support, but in truth most of the wealthy barely glanced at them, treating them as part of the background. Among these children was a girl, thin and pale, her hair tied in a rough braid. She held her hands close to her chest as if trying to hide herself from the world. Her name was Anna, and though she said nothing, her eyes were bright, watching everything carefully. She had always been quiet, always afraid that if she spoke too loudly, people would tell her to leave. Then, with the sound of laughter and heavy footsteps, a tall man in a black suit entered the hall. He was the CEO, the richest man in the room. People moved aside as if the ground itself had ordered them. His presence demanded attention. Everyone knew his face from magazines and news reports. He had built his empire from nothing, and now he stood like a king among commoners. He walked with his assistants, smiling at jokes, shaking hands with other men in power. Cameras followed him for a moment, then turned away when he waved them off. His eyes swept across the room not with kindness, but with the sharp gaze of a man always calculating. When his path brought him near the children, he barely slowed down. But just then, one of the younger boys tried to tug at his sleeve, asking for help. The man chuckled, patted the boy's head without stopping, and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "What can any of you do for me?" His words were playful but filled with pride. He wanted to amuse the crowd around him. A few guests laughed politely, and the assistant smirked then as he moved past. The shy girl, Anna, took a deep breath. She reached forward with trembling fingers and touched the edge of his sleeve. It was a soft, almost invisible motion, but it stopped the powerful man. Surprised, he turned his sharp eyes on her. For a moment, she wanted to pull back and run, but something inside her told her to stay. The CEO tilted his head, his lips curling in a half-smile. "And what about you, little one?" he asked. His voice was heavy, carrying across the space. The guests turned their eyes toward the small girl, curious about what she would do. Anna swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. I can play the piano." For a second, silence filled the space, then laughter exploded, loud and sharp. The CEO raised his brows and gave a deep chuckle. "Is that so?" he said, looking around at the crowd. "If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her." He said it like a joke, his voice dripping with amusement. The guests laughed with him, clapping lightly as if he had told a clever story. To them, it was nothing but entertainment. A silly moment in a night of wealth. No one believed the poor girl had any real talent. They expected her to touch the keys, make a few clumsy sounds, and then everyone would laugh again. But while the crowd laughed, Anna's heart pounded. She lifted her eyes slowly, and in them was no joke, only a desperate hope. She thought of the nights when she had sat alone in the orphanage, pressing her fingers against the cold windowsill and dreaming of a piano she once saw in a shop. She thought of the scraps of music she had taught herself by listening at the door of a music school nearby. Every note had been burned into her heart. She thought of her promise to herself that one day she would not just survive. She would show the world she had a voice. Even if it came from her hands on the keys now, standing in front of the richest man in the hall, she saw her one chance. Her lips trembled, but she whispered again, louder this time. "I can really play." The guests laughed once more, some shaking their heads. Others leaned in, curious to see what would happen next. The CEO waved a hand to the organizers, still smiling as if the whole thing was a small game. "Bring out the piano," he said. His tone was mocking, but his eyes glittered with curiosity. From the corner of the hall, the workers rolled out an old piano, forgotten and dusty. The sound of its wheels scraping against the floor made the guests wrinkle their noses. It did not belong in such a shining room, yet all eyes turned to it, waiting to see the poor girl's failure. Anna's heart beat so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. Her hands shook as she looked at the cracked wood. She had never touched this instrument before, never felt its keys, but she walked forward. Each step heavy with both fear and courage. The CEO leaned back, folding his arms. His assistants chuckled under their breath. The crowd whispered, already preparing for another laugh. But Anna pulled out the chair, sat down, and placed her tiny hands on the keys. The world seemed to stop moving, the air heavy with waiting. Her breath caught in her chest, and in that frozen silence, the first part of her story began. The piano looked as if it had been forgotten for years. It was pushed from the dark corner of the hall, its wheels squeaking loudly. The once polished wood was now scratched and dull. Dust clung to the edges, and one of the pedals hung loosely. Some of the guests covered their mouths to hide a laugh. The instrument did not belong to this shining place filled with crystal and gold. It looked too old, too broken, too poor. The workers struggled as they placed it near the center. The sound of the heavy wood scraping against the floor echoed through the room. Some people in the crowd whispered, "This is a waste of time." Others shook their heads and said, "She will only embarrass herself." They saw the shy little girl in her worn dress, and none of them believed she could create music worth hearing. The CEO chuckled, tapping his fingers on the table as if waiting for a clown to perform. His assistant smirked, ready to watch the girl fail. To them it was entertainment, nothing more. The promise he had made, "If she plays piano, I'll adopt her," was a joke to be forgotten once the laughter ended. But for Anna, the words were heavy like chains. She carried them in her heart as if they were a final chance. She walked slowly toward the piano. Her shoes made soft sounds on the floor, and her small hands clutched the sides of her dress. The lights from the chandelier above shone down, making her look even smaller in the giant hall. All eyes followed her, not with kindness but with curiosity and doubt. When she reached the bench, she stopped for a moment. Her chest rose and fell quickly. Her hands trembled as she touched the cracked wood of the piano. She could smell the dust rising from it. She pulled out the chair, the old bench creaking under her light weight, and sat down. The seat was too big for her. Her feet barely touched the floor. The crowd grew restless. Some of the men cleared their throats impatiently. A woman whispered, "She doesn't even know what to do." The CEO leaned back, folding his arms, his smile half mocking, half curious. He did not believe the girl would play, but he wanted to see her try. Anna placed her fingers gently on the keys. The ivory was chipped and yellow, the edges rough against her skin. She pressed one key softly, and a dull sound echoed out, flat and uneven. A ripple of laughter went through the room. Her cheeks burned red, but she did not look up. She pressed another key, then another. Testing the broken instrument, she knew it would not sound perfect. But in her heart, music was not about perfection. It was about soul. She closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the laughter, the whispers, and the flashing cameras. She remembered the nights when she sat outside the music school, listening to lessons through the walls. She remembered humming each note to herself until it lived inside her. She remembered tapping her fingers against her knees, pretending the world was her piano. Now, sitting before the real thing, she breathed in deeply. Her fear was still there, heavy in her chest. But another feeling began to rise, a quiet fire. She knew this was her only chance. If she failed, the CEO would walk away, the crowd would forget her, and she would return to the orphanage as nothing but a joke. But if she succeeded, her life might change forever. The room fell into uneasy silence, waiting. The CEO tilted his head, watching. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if something about her calm face made him curious. The assistants leaned closer, whispering to each other. The children standing in the corner of the hall held their breath, hoping she would not be laughed at again. Anna lifted her hand slightly. Her fingers curved like she had practiced 1,000 times in her dreams. She pressed down gently, not just one key but a chord. The sound rang out stronger, filling the hall with something different. The laughter stopped for a second. People turned their heads, wondering if they had imagined it. She pressed again, this time shaping the beginning of a melody. The broken piano groaned, but under her hands it began to sing soft. Uncertain at first, but with each touch, the notes grew more alive. The noise of the crowd died down, replaced by a growing silence. The CEO's smile faded just a little. His eyes followed her fingers, quick and delicate, moving as if they belonged to a child who had practiced on real pianos all her life. The lights of the chandeliers glowed above, and the room seemed smaller now. Every guest, every assistant, Even the CEO himself leaned in closer without meaning to. They waited to see if this was only luck. Only a few lucky notes. Anna's heart beat faster. But her hands did not stop. She was no longer thinking about the crowd, no longer thinking about the CEO's joke. She was thinking only of the music inside her. The forgotten piano that the crowd had laughed at was no longer just wood and keys. Under her touch it became alive. A voice for the dream she had carried in silence for years. Her head tilted slightly, her braid falling over her shoulder as she lost herself in the sound. The hall was no longer filled with laughter. It was filled with waiting, with suspense, with the strange feeling that something impossible was about to happen. And in that moment, just before the melody truly began, the people in the hall realized that what they were about to witness was no joke at all. Anna's small hands rested on the keys. The room was silent, as if the air itself was waiting to hear what she would do. Her heart beat so loudly that she thought everyone could hear it. Her lips pressed together and her shoulders shook with nerves. For a moment she almost pulled her hands away, almost gave up. But then she remembered the CEO's words, his mocking promise to adopt her if she could play. She remembered the laughter of the guests, the doubt in their eyes, and suddenly her fear began to turn into determination. She pressed one key gently, and a single note floated into the air. It was clear and strong, though the piano was old. That single sound broke the silence. Every head turned and the whispers stopped. The CEO raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly forward. His mocking smile faded just a little. Anna's chest rose and fell quickly as she pressed another note. Then another. The sound was uneven at first. Some keys sharp, some dull, but she kept going, her fingers moving faster. She began to shape the melody she had practiced only in her mind for years. The song she carried in her heart finally touched the world. The first few notes grew into a line of music, soft but steady. It was like a secret being spoken out loud for the very first time. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. They had expected noise, maybe laughter, but not this. The assistant stopped whispering. The children in the corner opened their mouths in awe. Her small frame bent slightly as she leaned into the piano, her braid falling over her shoulder. Her fingers danced across the chipped ivory. Every touch seemed too delicate for such strength. But with every note, the melody grew clearer. The piano was broken, yes, but under her hands, it became something magical. The guests leaned closer, their laughter gone, their eyes wide with surprise. They had never imagined that the little girl in the plain dress could bring life out of such a forgotten instrument. The music spread through the hall, curling into every corner. Touching every ear, Anna's eyes closed. She was no longer in the hall filled with cold eyes and cruel laughter. In her mind, she was back at the orphanage, sitting by the window, pressing her fingers against the wood and pretending it was a keyboard. She remembered humming softly at night, trying not to wake the other children. She remembered listening outside the music school, catching each note, memorizing it, living it now. With her hands on the piano, she was free. She poured every memory, every tear, every wish into the music. Her fingers moved faster, the sound swelling, filling the air with emotion so heavy that even the chandeliers seemed to tremble. The CEO's eyes narrowed. His arms, once crossed in amusement, slowly dropped to the table. He leaned forward, his face no longer carrying the same smile. He had thought this would be over in seconds, but now he could not look away. Something stirred in his chest that he had not felt in years. The audience grew still. No one whispered anymore. No one laughed, they simply stared. Their hearts caught in the unexpected storm of music. The girl's hands were small, her body fragile, but her sound was powerful. It was not just a song, it was a cry, a dream, a story poured into every note. Her trembling began to fade, replaced by confidence. She pressed harder, faster, as if the piano belonged to her. The melody lifted and dropped, rising like hope, falling like sorrow. The sound moved like waves across the hall, washing over every person there. Anna's body swayed gently with the rhythm. Her eyes squeezed shut, her lips parted slightly. It was as if she and the piano were one. Every key she touched answered her with a voice older and stronger than the wood itself. And then something happened that no one expected. The broken piano under her touch seemed to heal. The uneven notes blended into something breathtaking. The sound was not perfect, but it was alive, raw, and full of soul. It was the kind of music that could not be ignored, the kind that could reach even the coldest heart. The CEO's hand tightened on the table. His eyes followed every movement. His thoughts raced. Was this the same child he had mocked moments ago? The one he thought would bring nothing but laughter? Now he could not laugh. He could only listen. The crowd sat frozen, some with their mouths open, others with tears already shining in their eyes. They felt the weight of each note, as if the girl was speaking directly to their souls. She was not just playing, she was telling them her story. The girl's thin shoulders moved as she reached the higher notes. Her fingers leaped across the keys with surprising speed. The melody rose higher and higher, filling the golden hall with fire and light. It felt as if time had stopped, as if the world outside no longer existed. And then came a sudden pause. She lifted her hands just for a second. The silence that followed was so deep that the guests could hear their own hearts beating. All eyes were locked on her, waiting. She opened her eyes slightly, and in them was a glimmer of determination stronger than anything the crowd had ever seen. Her fingers came down again, harder this time, and the hall shook with the force of her sound. The first note had been small, trembling, but now it was powerful, commanding. It was no longer the sound of a shy orphan girl. It was the sound of a prodigy. The first note had been enough to silence the room, but now, as she played without fear, the room realized something none of them had expected. This girl was no joke, she was something rare, something extraordinary, and her story was only beginning. The music grew stronger, rising from the broken piano like a river breaking its banks. At first, the people in the hall had thought it was only a lucky start, a few good notes from a desperate girl, but as the melody spread, they felt something heavy pressing on their hearts. The laughter that had once filled the golden room disappeared completely. The clinking of glasses stopped. Even the waiters froze where they stood, holding trays in mid-air. Every ear was listening, every eye was watching. Anna's fingers no longer trembled. They moved with speed and grace, dancing over the cracked ivory like they had been trained for years. Her shoulders swayed gently. Her head tilted as if the music was carrying her away. The piano, old and uneven, groaned under her touch but still obeyed. Each note she pulled out of it shone brighter than the chandeliers above. The crowd sat in silence. Many of them had heard world-famous pianists perform in grand concert halls. But this was different. This was not just skill. It was soul, raw and pure. It felt like the music was not coming from the piano at all, but from the girl's very heart. The CEO leaned forward slowly, his eyes fixed on the small figure sitting at the center of the hall. Moments ago he had laughed, his words sharp with pride. Now his jaw tightened, his smile gone. Something strange stirred inside him, a feeling he had buried long ago. For years he had surrounded himself with money, with power, with empty jokes and business deals. But this girl, this orphan with nothing, was reaching a part of him he thought no longer existed. Some of the women in the crowd lifted their hands to their mouths, trying to hide the tears that threatened to fall. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their pride shaken. They had come to the event expecting wine, fine food, and polite speeches. Instead, they found themselves caught in a storm of music played by a little girl in a faded dress. The children at the back pressed closer, their eyes wide, their small bodies leaning forward. They had grown up with Anna. They knew her quiet nature, her soft voice. They had never seen her shine like this. Some of them whispered her name under their breath, praying she would not stop. Anna's eyes were closed. She was not playing for the crowd. Not even for the CEO, she was playing for herself. For every lonely night. For every dream she had carried in silence. The piano was her voice, and tonight it was louder than all the laughter. Louder than all the doubt. The melody rose higher, swelling with emotion, then softened into a gentle whisper. It was like watching a storm turn into a calm sea. The crowd leaned in, holding their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might break the spell. The CEO's hands tightened into fists, his chest rising and falling quickly. He could not explain why the music hit him so deeply, but he knew this was no ordinary child. Every note painted a picture. The guests could almost see it, a story told through sound. They saw the loneliness of the orphanage, the hunger, the longing. They felt the cold nights where Anna had no one to hold her. They felt the warmth of her hope, fragile but unbroken. The chandeliers glittered as if they too were listening. The golden walls reflected the sound back into the room, trapping everyone in the magic of her song. The hall, which had once been filled with shallow conversations and shallow smiles, now felt like a sacred place. Anna's body moved with the rhythm, her small frame lost in the sea of music. Her braids swung with each motion. Her lips moved slightly as if she was whispering words no one could hear. The audience sat frozen, unable to turn away. When her fingers struck a deep, heavy chord, the sound echoed like thunder. Some guests jumped slightly in their chairs. The melody then climbed again, higher and higher, until it was almost too much for the room to hold. Her hands blurred as they moved, her arms flowing with the music like water, and then suddenly she paused for just a breath. Silence filled the hall. It was not the silence of doubt or mockery. It was the silence of awe. No one dared move. The air was thick, every heart beating fast. The CEO leaned so close now that his elbows rested on the table. His eyes were wide, locked on the girl. He had forgotten about his assistants, forgotten about the crowd, forgotten about his own careless promise. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Anna opened her eyes, and for a moment, she looked out at the sea of faces staring at her. She saw no more laughter, no more cruel smiles. She saw shock, wonder, even respect. Her lips curled in the smallest of smiles, just for herself. Then she looked back down, and her hands began to move again. The final stretch of her piece came alive. Faster, sharper, more powerful than before. It was like fire spreading across the hall. Unstoppable, the audience could not breathe, could not think. They were no longer watching a little orphan girl. They were witnessing a prodigy, a miracle hidden in plain sight. When the last note rang out, echoing against the golden walls, the silence that followed was so deep that it hurt. Everyone sat frozen, staring at the small girl with their mouths slightly open, and in that heavy silence, the truth settled over them all. This was no joke. No accident, no trick of chance. The girl they had ignored, the girl they had laughed at, had just taken their breath away with nothing but her hands and an old broken piano. The final note of her song still echoed faintly in the grand hall, hanging in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had frozen around the little girl sitting at the piano. Her hands rested gently on the keys, her chest rising and falling quickly, her braids sliding down her shoulder as she lowered her head. Then slowly the silence began to break. A single clap echoed from somewhere at the back. Hesitant, unsure, another joined, then another, until the sound grew louder. The applause filled the hall like thunder rolling across the sky. People stood from their chairs without realizing it, their faces shining with awe. The same guests who had laughed at her moments ago were now clapping with tears in their eyes. Anna lifted her head in surprise. Her eyes widened as she saw the crowd standing for her. For so long she had been invisible, ignored and forgotten. Now every eye was on her, not with mockery but with respect. Her lips trembled, and her small hands clutched her dress. She had not expected this. She had only wanted to show them her truth, but she had given them something far greater. The music she played had been more than just sound. It was her story, her soul, her life poured into every note, and the people had felt it deeply. They were not clapping just for skill. They were clapping for the courage, the heart, the miracle they had just witnessed. One of the women in the front row wiped her tears with a handkerchief, whispering to the man beside her, "She is a prodigy. I've never heard anything like it." A man in a fine suit shook his head slowly, saying, "Not even the professionals can play with such fire." Their voices carried through the applause, words of admiration instead of doubt. The children at the back cheered, clapping their small hands with all their strength. Their faces glowed with pride. They had always known Anna was different, but even they had not imagined she could bring a whole room of powerful strangers to silence and tears. The CEO, however, did not clap. He sat frozen in his chair, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the girl. His assistants glanced at him nervously, unsure of what to do. He had been the one to make the careless promise. He had been the one to mock her. And now, before his very eyes, the girl had turned his words into something real. His chest rose and fell heavily. His thoughts were in chaos. He had built his life on control, on never being surprised, on always being the one with power. Yet here was a little girl, with nothing but a pair of trembling hands, and she had shaken the ground beneath him. Anna stood slowly from the bench, her legs felt weak, and her heart still raced from the performance. She looked around at the clapping crowd, unsure if she should smile, bow, or run. She gave a small, awkward nod, her cheeks burning, and stepped back from the piano. Her eyes, however, searched for one person. She looked at the CEO, the man who had promised her a future, Even if it was only a joke, the applause softened, and all eyes turned toward him. The guests whispered among themselves, "What will he do now?"
He cannot break his word. She earned it. The room,
Which had once been filled with laughter at his joke, now demanded he keep it. But the CEO did not move. He stared at the girl, his mind heavy with thoughts he could not explain. His pride fought against his heart. He had not planned this. He had not wanted this, yet deep inside, he felt something pulling him toward her, something stronger than pride, stronger than doubt. The crowd grew restless. Some shouted, "You promised." Others clapped louder, urging him to rise. The children's eyes were wide with hope, waiting for the words that could change Anna's life forever. Anna stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She did not speak, she did not beg, she only looked at him with those clear eyes, eyes that carried no pride, no trick, only the simple hope of a child. That look pierced through the CEO's chest, cutting through the walls he had built around himself for years. The applause finally slowed, fading into silence again. The only sound was the faint creak of the old piano, still echoing the memory of her song. The guests leaned forward, their hearts beating fast. Waiting for the moment, the CEO exhaled deeply. His face was unreadable, his assistants whispered in his ear, but he raised a hand to silence them. His gaze stayed locked on the girl. She stood so small, so fragile, and yet she had shaken him in a way no rival, no business, no fortune ever could. For the first time in his life, the man who had always laughed at the world was no longer laughing. He felt the weight of his words, the promise he had made in mockery, and the truth that had been revealed by her music. He had wanted entertainment, but he had found something far greater. The hall waited, the silence thick. The little girl's eyes did not leave his, and in that heavy silence, everyone knew. Whatever he said next would change both of their lives forever. The hall that had once been filled with clapping and cheers slowly quieted down. The echo of the last applause faded into the golden walls. All eyes turned back to the CEO. Everyone waited for him to stand, to speak, to honor his promise. But he did not move. He sat frozen in his chair, his strong hands resting on the table, his sharp eyes locked on the little girl who had just shaken his world. Anna stood near the piano, her small figure almost swallowed by the grand size of the hall. She looked down at her shoes, unsure of what would happen next. She had played with everything inside her. She had shown them her soul, and yet in her heart fear crept in. What if he laughed again? What if he turned away? The guests whispered among themselves, their voices carried across the silence. Why doesn't he say something? He promised, we all heard him. She played better than anyone could have imagined. The air was filled with impatience, but also with curiosity. They wanted to see if the man who ruled companies, who crushed rivals, who never bent to anyone, would bend now for a little orphan girl. The CEO leaned back slowly in his chair. His face was unreadable. His assistant stood stiffly behind him, waiting for orders, but none came. For the first time, their leader seemed unsure. His heart and his mind were at war in his world. Promises made in jest meant nothing. But tonight had been different. This child had changed the meaning of his words. Anna lifted her head slightly. Her big eyes searched for him through the crowd. She did not speak. She did not beg. She only waited. She remembered the way he had said it, with laughter in his voice. She knew he had not meant it, but still some small part of her heart held on to hope. Because for her it had never been a joke. For her, those words were everything. The CEO felt her gaze like a weight pressing on him. He wanted to look away, but he could not. He saw not just a girl, but a reflection of something he had long forgotten. Innocence, courage, and a dream that would not die. Memories stirred in him, memories of his own childhood. The days when he had nothing but ambition and a burning desire to prove himself. The fire he once carried was the same fire he now saw in her. Still he did not speak. He sat in silence, his lips pressed into a thin line. The hall grew tense. The crowd began to shift restlessly. Some of them frowned, disappointed. Others crossed their arms, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. Anna's small hands gripped her dress tightly. Her heart pounded. She thought for a moment that maybe he would stand up and walk away, that all her effort, all her courage, would mean nothing. Tears began to prick her eyes, but she fought them back. She had promised herself she would not cry, not here, not in front of all these people. And then something changed. The CEO leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, His eyes softened just a little, it was barely noticeable. But Anna saw it for the first time. The coldness in his gaze was gone, replaced by something almost human, almost gentle. The guests noticed it too. They fell silent again, waiting, hoping. One of the children whispered, "Say it, please say it." The sound carried further than he expected, and the CEO heard it. For a long breath, the room was still. And then the man who had built an empire on steel and pride opened his mouth, but no words came out. He closed it again, struggling, his throat tightened. He had spoken in countless boardrooms, given speeches to thousands, crushed rivals with sharp sentences, but tonight, in front of this little girl, he could not find his voice. Anna tilted her head, her eyes wide with confusion. Why was he silent? Why did he not speak? Her small lips trembled, but she stayed quiet, waiting. Her silence was stronger than any plea. It was her faith in him, even after his mockery, that made the moment heavier than gold. The CEO's fingers tapped the table slowly. His assistants leaned closer, whispering in his ear again, "Sir, we should move on. This is nothing but a distraction." But he raised a hand sharply, silencing them. His eyes never left the girl. The hall was so quiet now that even the sound of someone breathing seemed loud. The chandeliers glowed warmly above. The piano stood like a silent witness, and in the middle of it all, the man and the girl stared at each other. Finally, the CEO exhaled. A long, heavy breath, his voice came out low, almost strained. "You surprise me?" The crowd leaned forward. Waiting for more, he paused, his words heavy. "No one has done that in a long time," the guests murmured. Their curiosity growing, Anna's eyes blinked rapidly. She felt a flicker of hope. But she stayed still, her heart beating fast. The CEO leaned back again, closing his eyes for a brief moment. His silence was not the silence of mockery anymore. It was the silence of a man fighting with himself, fighting between pride and truth, between a joke and a promise for the first time in years. The great CEO was speechless, not because he had nothing to say, but because his next words would change everything. The hall grew restless, the silence had stretched too long. The CEO's words had been few, and still the crowd waited for more. They had not forgotten what he had promised. His voice had been loud and clear earlier when he said, "If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her." The joke had been made for their amusement, but now, after what the girl had shown them, nobody was laughing. A murmur spread through the guests like a wave. "He must keep his word," someone whispered. "She earned it," another said. Soon the voices grew louder, echoing through the grand hall, until finally one man stood up and shouted, "You promised!" His words cut through the air like a blade. The room fell silent again, but the silence this time was filled with tension. All eyes turned to the CEO. The girl stood still beside the piano, her hands folded in front of her. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She wanted to believe, but doubt clawed at her heart. Would he really keep his word? Or would he walk away and let her fall back into the shadows of the orphanage? The CEO sat frozen, his hands tightened on the edge of the table. His jaw clenched, his assistants leaned closer, whispering again, "Sir, you don't have to do this." It was a joke. They will forget. But he did not answer them. His gaze stayed locked on the little girl. The crowd, however, would not let him escape. "You promised." Another voice shouted. This time it came from a woman near the front. Her eyes were wet with tears. "You said it yourself." More voices joined. "Keep your word. Don't go back on it." The sound grew louder, the pressure heavier. The children at the back added their voices, their small hands clapping, their faces bright with hope. "Adopt her! Adopt her!" they chanted. Their innocent voices struck deeper than the cries of the adults. The CEO's chest tightened as he listened. For the first time in years, he felt trapped, not by rivals, not by contracts, but by the truth of his own words. Anna's eyes lifted slowly. She looked at him again. Her gaze soft but steady. She did not beg. She did not cry. She only waited. That quiet faith, that silent strength, cut through his pride more sharply than the voices of the crowd. She stood there as if she already belonged, as if she already trusted him. The CEO's throat felt dry. He opened his mouth and closed it. His pride screamed at him to stay silent, to walk away. But something stronger pushed against it, something he could not explain. In her eyes he saw himself, the boy he once was. Poor, desperate, overlooked. He had fought his way to power, but in doing so, he had buried that part of himself. This girl had just pulled it back into the light. The guests leaned forward, their eyes sharp. They wanted to see if the man they had always feared would dare to back out now. His reputation was at stake, but more than that, something deeper was at stake. They all felt it. They knew this was no longer about business. This was about humanity. Finally, the CEO pushed his chair back. The sound of the legs scraping across the floor echoed loudly. The crowd fell silent at once. Anna's heart jumped in her chest, her breath caught. Her small fingers gripped her dress so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The tall man stood towering over everyone. His face was hard, his eyes sharp, but his voice, when it came, was low and heavy. "I made a promise." The room went still. Every ear strained to hear his next words, "And tonight, that promise will not be broken." Gasps filled the hall. Some clapped instantly, others whispered in disbelief. But Anna only stared, her eyes wide, her small chest rising and falling fast. Did she hear him right? Had he really said it? The CEO walked slowly toward her, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The crowd parted as he passed, all eyes followed him. The man who never bowed to anyone was walking toward a little orphan girl as if nothing else in the world mattered. When he reached her, he stopped. Towering above her small frame, she looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears she could no longer hold back. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. His voice was steady, carrying across the room. "From this day forward, you are not alone. From today, you are my daughter." The crowd erupted. Some clapped, some cried, others simply shook their heads in awe. The children cheered so loudly their voices echoed through the golden hall. The assistant stood stunned, unable to believe what they were hearing. Anna's knees went weak, she could hardly breathe. The tears spilled from her eyes as she threw her small arms around him, burying her face in his chest. For so long she had dreamed of family, of belonging, and now in one night with one song, that dream had come true. The CEO's arms wrapped around her slowly. Awkwardly at first, but then firmly, he held her close, his heart heavy with feelings he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He could feel her tears soaking into his suit, and for once he did not care. The hall roared with applause again, louder than ever before, but for Anna and the CEO, the sound faded into the background. In that moment, there was only the two of them, the man who had once laughed at her, and the little girl who had changed his life with music. Anna's small arms clung tightly to the man's chest. Her tears flowed freely now, warm against his suit. For a moment she could not believe this was real. All her life she had waited for someone to choose her, to see her, to call her their own, and now, in front of a hall full of strangers, the most powerful man she had ever seen had spoken the words she thought she would never hear. The CEO stood tall, but his strong arms held her gently. He had shaken hands with presidents, signed deals worth millions, and commanded entire companies, but never had his chest felt so heavy, so human. The little girl in his arms was not a contract, not a bargain. She was something far more. She was family. The crowd erupted again. The applause thundered against the golden walls. Some people cheered, others cried openly. They had come expecting another ordinary evening of food and speeches. But they had witnessed something unforgettable. Their eyes were not on the chandeliers, not on the wealth, but on the sight of a small orphan girl and the man who had just given her a future. The children at the back jumped and clapped, their voices echoing together. "She has a father now. She has a father!" Their innocent joy spread like fire. Even the workers who had rolled out the dusty piano wiped their eyes and smiled. The hall had been transformed, not by the gold or the lights, but by the music and the promise that followed it. Anna finally pulled back a little. She looked up at him, her big eyes filled with tears and wonder. "Really?" she whispered, her voice so soft that only he could hear. "Really? I'm your daughter now?" Her words trembled, as if she feared the world would take them back the moment she spoke them. The CEO looked down at her, and for once his sharp eyes softened completely. He placed a hand on her cheek and nodded. "Yes," he said firmly, his voice carrying both strength and warmth. "From today you are mine. You are family." Her lips parted in a shaky smile, the first true smile she had dared to show in years. She buried her face back into his chest, holding on tightly as if afraid he might disappear. He held her closer, and for the first time in years, the hall saw the man not as a CEO, not as a giant of business, but simply as a father. The guests whispered among themselves. "This is history," one man said. "He has never done anything like this before." A woman nodded. wiping her eyes. She is going to change his life, another added. And he will change hers. The assistants, who had once tried to whisper in his ear to walk away, stood silently. Their boss had made his decision, a decision stronger than any business deal they had ever witnessed. They knew this moment would follow him forever. Anna's heart was full. She remembered the cold nights in the orphanage, the hunger, the loneliness, the way she often pressed her hands against the windowsill, dreaming of playing the piano for someone who would listen. Tonight, those dreams had become real. Her music had not just been heard, it had given her a home. The CEO lifted her slightly in his arms, as if she weighed nothing at all. The crowd applauded again, the sound rolling like thunder. He walked with her through the hall, the lights shining down on them. The little girl wiped her tears but held on to him tightly, afraid it was all still a dream. When they reached the doors, the children cheered louder. Their voices followed Anna as she looked back at them. Her eyes promised them something too, that one day she would play again, not just for herself, not just for him, but for all of them, for every child who felt forgotten. She would carry their voice in her music. The CEO stepped out into the cool night air with her in his arms. The stars above sparkled, as if the universe itself had come to witness the moment. Anna rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes closing from exhaustion and relief. For the first time she felt safe, truly safe. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew one thing. She would never be alone again. Back inside the hall, the broken piano stood silently, dust still clinging to its wood. But for everyone who had heard it tonight, it would never be forgotten. That old instrument, once ignored, had become the voice of a miracle. And so the story of Anna, the little orphan girl, spread far beyond that hall. People would tell it again and again, about the night a child played like a prodigy and changed the heart of a man who thought nothing could move him. They would remember how laughter turned into tears, how a joke turned into a promise, and how music turned into family. As the car drove away, the girl leaned against the man who was now her father. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Thank you." Her voice trembled with emotion. The CEO looked out the window, his jaw firm, but his eyes shining with something new. He did not answer at first. Then, after a moment, he whispered back, "No, thank you." The city lights passed by, but inside the car it was quiet, peaceful. The man who once thought he had everything had just realized he had been missing the most important thing. And the girl who once had nothing had just gained the world. That night did not just change her life. It changed his too. And together their story was only beginning.